The evening air had a crisp feel to it as Thomas stepped out of his car at the entrance of Le Ciel. The restaurant stood like a glittering jewel against the darkening sky, its name displayed in elegant gold lettering above the door. Thomas handed his keys to the valet, who gave him a quick nod and a polite smile before driving away with his modest sedan. Thomas ran a hand over his casual button-up shirt, smoothing out invisible wrinkles. He hadn't had time to change after spending the afternoon at the youth center in the city's east side. The opening of the new computer lab had run longer than expected, with so many excited kids wanting to show him what they could already do with the donated equipment. Their enthusiasm had been worth every minute, even if it meant coming to dinner in jeans and a button-up rather than the suit he'd normally wear to a place like this. The glass doors of Le Ciel swished open silently as Thomas approached. Inside, the restaurant hummed with the quiet conversations of the wealthy and powerful. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables draped in pristine white linen. The air smelled of truffle oil and expensive wine. At the host stand, a young woman with perfectly styled hair greeted him with practiced charm. "Good evening, sir. Do you have a reservation with us tonight?" "Yes," Thomas replied with a warm smile. "Under the name Wilson." The hostess scanned her tablet, her expression shifting subtly when she found his name. "Ah, yes. Table for one. Richard will be right with you to show you to your table." A waiter appeared at her side within moments. Richard stood tall and thin, with graying hair at his temples and the kind of posture that came from years of fine dining service. His eyes moved over Thomas quickly, taking in the casual clothes and the simple watch on his wrist. "This way, sir," Richard said, his tone professional but noticeably cooler than the animated conversations he'd been having with the suited guests at the bar. He led Thomas through the main dining area, past tables of people in evening wear and designer labels, toward the back of the restaurant. Thomas noticed several empty tables in the center of the dining room, some marked with small reserved signs, others simply waiting for guests. Instead of stopping at any of these, Richard continued toward a corner table partly hidden behind a decorative pillar, near the swinging doors to the kitchen. "Will this be acceptable?" Richard asked, pulling out the chair. Thomas paused, looking around at the far more desirable empty tables. "Actually, I was hoping for something a bit more central. Perhaps one of those tables by the window." Richard's smile tightened. "I'm afraid those are reserved for our regular guests. This section is quite nice, though. Very private." Thomas decided not to push the issue. He'd faced this kind of treatment before. "This will be fine, then," he said, taking his seat. "Very good, sir." Richard handed him a menu. "Would you like to hear about our specials this evening?" "Yes, please." Thomas nodded, genuinely interested despite the waiter's dismissive tone. Richard rattled off the specials at twice his normal speed, barely pausing for breath. The chef is offering a truffle risotto with gold leaf as a starter, followed by a Dover sole with beurre blanc, and for the main, a Kobe beef with foie gras and seasonal vegetables. Our sommelier suggests the 2015 Chateau Margaux to complement the meal. He finished with an expression that suggested he didn't expect Thomas to order any of these premium items. "The risotto sounds excellent," Thomas said, "and I'd also like to know more about your wine selection." "I'm particularly interested in red wines from small vineyards." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Perhaps I can direct you to our house red? It's quite accessible." The implication that Thomas might be looking for something cheaper wasn't lost on him. "Actually," Thomas said patiently, "I was thinking more along the lines of a Pinot Noir from Oregon, or perhaps something from the Rhone Valley." "Do you have anything from Domaine de la Romanée-Conti?" Richard blinked, clearly surprised by Thomas's knowledge. "We do have a few bottles, but they're among our most premium offerings." "I'm aware of their quality," Thomas replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'll look through the wine list while I decide on my main course." "As you wish." Richard placed a leather-bound wine list on the table and left, his steps a bit quicker than when he'd arrived. At a nearby table, a group of executives in expensive suits were being attended to by two waiters, who described each dish with passionate detail and made recommendations with genuine enthusiasm. Their wine glasses never emptied, and their bread basket was promptly refilled without request. Meanwhile, Thomas sat with an empty water glass for 10 minutes before Richard returned. The waiter placed a basket of bread on the table without a word about the selection. Unlike the detailed description the next table had received about the sourdough, olive loaf, and house-made butter, "Have you decided?" Richard asked, his pen poised over his notepad. "Yes," Thomas said. "I'll start with the truffle risotto. For the main course, I'd like the chef's duck special, and I'll have a glass of the Domaine Leroy Chambertin Grand Cru." Richard's pen hesitated. "The Domaine Leroy is $250 per glass, sir." "I'm aware of the price," Thomas replied calmly. "Very well," Richard said, a note of doubt still in his voice. "Will there be anything else?" "Just some water for now, thank you." Richard nodded and left. Thomas could see him speaking with another waiter by the bar, both glancing in his direction. The other waiter chuckled at something Richard said. Thomas took a deep breath and looked around the restaurant. The decor was stunning. Hand-painted murals on the ceiling, artwork worth more than most people's homes on the walls. He recognized the style of a famous artist in one painting, having recently acquired a similar piece for his company's headquarters. A young couple at a nearby table caught his eye. They were dressed impeccably, with the woman wearing a necklace that Thomas recognized from a jewelry designer his wife favored. The man was talking loudly about his new yacht, gesturing with hands that had likely never seen a day of hard labor. Thomas thought about the children he'd met earlier that day. Bright, eager faces full of potential, some of them living in neighborhoods where a single meal at Le Ciel would equal a week's worth of groceries for their families. The contrast wasn't lost on him. Richard returned with the water and bread, but without the wine. "Your risotto will be out shortly," he said before turning to leave. "Excuse me," Thomas called. "I ordered a glass of wine as well." "The sommelier is locating the bottle," Richard replied with a tight smile. "It's not often requested by the glass," Thomas nodded. He knew that was likely true, but also suspected that the staff was skeptical about his ability to pay for such an expensive choice. While waiting, Thomas noticed a group entering the restaurant. They were greeted with immediate deference, the maître d' himself coming from behind his stand to welcome them, waiters appearing as if by magic to pull out chairs and unfold napkins. The group was seated at one of the premium tables that had supposedly been reserved. His risotto arrived, presented with considerably less flourish than the dishes being served to other tables. Richard placed it down without description and asked, "Is there anything else you need at the moment?" "My wine hasn't arrived yet," Thomas reminded him. "I'll check on that right away," Richard said, though his tone suggested it wasn't a priority, as Thomas began to eat his risotto, which was, despite everything, exceptionally good. He noticed a woman entering the restaurant. She walked with the confidence of someone who knew her own worth. The staff practically fell over themselves to greet her. She was scanning the restaurant as if looking for someone, and to Thomas's surprise, her eyes lit up when they landed on him. She changed direction immediately, walking purposefully toward his corner table, followed by a flustered maître d'. "There you are," she called out, her voice warm and genuinely pleased. "I hoped I might catch you here." Thomas looked up, recognition dawning on his face as Diane Chen, editor-in-chief of Business Forward magazine, approached his table with a wide smile. Behind her, Richard had appeared with the overdue glass of wine, his expression shifting from dismissive to confused as he watched the interaction unfold. The wheels of change had begun to turn, though Richard didn't know it yet. What happened next would change not just his evening, but his entire perspective on the people he served each day at Le Ciel. Diane Chen stood by Thomas's table, her sleek business attire and confident posture drawing glances from nearby diners. Thomas rose to greet her, his smile genuine as they shook hands. "What a wonderful surprise," Thomas said. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight." "I'm meeting with my editorial team," Diane explained, gesturing toward a table where 3 well-dressed professionals were settling in. "But I spotted you and had to come say hello. The issue with your cover story is flying off shelves, by the way. People are fascinated by what you're doing with sustainable technology." Richard, who had been standing nearby with Thomas's wine, nearly fumbled the glass. His eyes widened slightly as he processed this information. He placed the wine on the table with considerably more care than he had shown with the risotto. "Your wine, sir," Richard said, his tone noticeably warmer. Excellent choice. Would you like to taste it first?" Thomas nodded, maintaining his composure despite the sudden shift in treatment. He took a small sip, letting the complex flavors settle on his palate before nodding his approval. "It's perfect, thank you." Diane glanced between Thomas and Richard, her keen eyes missing nothing. "I should get back to my table, but it was good to see you, Thomas. Let's catch up soon about that education initiative you mentioned in our interview." "Absolutely," Thomas agreed. "Give my best to your team." As Diane walked away, Richard hovered by the table, his demeanor completely transformed. "Is the risotto to your liking, sir? The chef uses a special variety of truffle imported from Italy." This detailed description was notably absent when the dish had first arrived. "It's delicious," Thomas replied simply. He could almost see the wheels turning in Richard's head as the waiter reassessed who he was serving. "If you'll excuse me." "I'll check on your main course," Richard said, backing away with a slight bow that he hadn't bothered with earlier. Left alone, Thomas took another sip of his wine, savoring the moment of quiet. At nearby tables, conversations continued, business deals being negotiated, relationships being celebrated, all against the backdrop of wealth and privilege that defined Le Ciel. A couple at the next table glanced over curiously, clearly wondering who he was to have attracted the attention of someone as recognizable as Diane Chen. When Richard returned, he was accompanied by another server who carried a fresh bread basket, with what Richard now described as our house-made sourdough, olive focaccia, and rosemary rolls, served with French butter and cold-pressed olive oil. The second server refilled Thomas's water glass and adjusted his silverware with meticulous attention. "Your duck will be out momentarily," Richard assured him. "The chef is giving it his personal attention." "Thank you," Thomas said, wondering if the chef even knew which table was receiving the dish, or if Richard had made a special point to mention it. "While you wait, perhaps you might enjoy hearing about our dessert selection? We have a chocolate soufflé that requires advanced preparation if you're interested." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "The same soufflé you didn't mention earlier when you rushed through the specials?" Richard had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I may have overlooked some details in my earlier description. My apologies." "I see," Thomas said, letting the moment stretch just long enough to make Richard squirm. "I'll consider the soufflé after my main course." "Very good, sir." Richard retreated again, this time stopping to speak with a man in a tailored suit who appeared to be the restaurant manager. Both men glanced in Thomas's direction, and the manager's expression shifted from concern to interest. Thomas returned his attention to his risotto, which was truly exceptional despite the circumstances of its delivery. As he ate, he noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere around his table. Servers who had previously ignored him now found reasons to pass by, offering small nods of acknowledgement. Nearby diners cast curious glances his way, perhaps wondering why the staff's attitude had changed so dramatically. The manager approached the table, his stride purposeful and his smile professionally warm. "Good evening, sir. I'm Anthony Keller, the general manager of Le Ciel. I wanted to personally ensure that you're enjoying your dining experience with us tonight." Thomas looked up at him calmly. "The food is excellent," he said simply. "I'm delighted to hear that," Anthony replied. "Please let me know if there's anything at all we can do to make your evening more enjoyable. It's not every day we have the honor of serving someone of your distinction." The careful choice of words wasn't lost on Thomas. "Someone of my distinction," he repeated. "I'm curious, Mr. Keller. What distinction are you referring to exactly?" The manager faltered slightly. "Well, Ms. Chen mentioned, that is, we understand your—" He cleared his throat. "We value all our guests, of course." "Of course," Thomas echoed, his voice level but his eyes challenging. "Though some seem to be valued more obviously than others." Anthony shifted uncomfortably. "If there's been any oversight in our service, I sincerely apologize." "No apology necessary," Thomas said. "I'm simply making an observation." Before the manager could respond, Richard appeared with the duck, presenting it with a flourish that bordered on theatrical. "Your Muscovy duck breast, sir, prepared with a honey lavender glaze served with wild mushroom risotto and seasonal vegetables. The chef has included a special truffle sauce on the side." This description was delivered with the kind of reverent detail that had been entirely absent from his earlier interactions. "Thank you," Thomas said, maintaining his dignity despite the obvious change in treatment. "Is there anything else I can bring you?" Richard asked, hovering attentively. "Not at the moment, thank you." As Richard and the manager reluctantly withdrew, Thomas began to eat his main course. The duck was perfectly prepared, the meat tender and flavorful, Despite the unpleasant beginning to his evening, he was determined to enjoy the meal. Across the restaurant, he could see Diane and her team engaged in animated conversation. She caught his eye and raised her glass slightly in his direction. Thomas returned the gesture with a small smile. 2 tables away, a group of businessmen were loudly discussing a recent acquisition, their voices carrying through the restaurant as they became more intoxicated. "50 million, one of them declared, and worth every penny to keep those assets out of the public sector." Thomas listened with half an ear as he ate, mentally comparing their approach to business with his own company's mission of creating sustainable technology that benefited communities rather than just shareholders. His thoughts drifted to the youth center he'd visited earlier, and the bright-eyed children who had shown him their first computer programs with such pride. Richard returned to the table just as Thomas was finishing his duck. "How was everything, sir?" "Excellent," Thomas replied honestly. "Wonderful," Richard said, his tone ingratiating. "Now about that chocolate souffle I mentioned. It would be my pleasure to order that for you. On the house, of course." Thomas considered the offer. "Why would it be on the house?" Richard blinked, caught off guard by the direct question. "Well, we like to show our appreciation to our special guests. And what makes me special compared to when I first arrived?" Thomas asked, his voice calm but pointed. Richard's confident facade cracked slightly. That is, he fumbled for words, clearly uncomfortable. "We always strive to provide excellent service to all our guests." "Do you?" Thomas asked. "Because my experience suggests otherwise. When I arrived, I was seated in the worst table despite better options being available. My questions about the menu were dismissed. You suggested the house wine rather than discussing the premium options I inquired about. It was only after Ms. Chen approached my table that the level of service changed dramatically." Richard's face flushed. The nearby tables had grown quieter, some diners clearly listening to the exchange. "Sir, I can assure you—" "You don't need to assure me of anything," Thomas interrupted gently. "But I would appreciate a moment of your time when I've finished my meal. There's something I'd like to discuss with you." Richard nodded stiffly. "Of course, sir. I'll return shortly to clear your plate." As Richard walked away, his shoulders tense, Thomas took another sip of his wine. He wasn't angry exactly. He had encountered this kind of treatment too many times to be truly surprised by it. But he was tired of having to prove his worth based on external validation, tired of watching people's behavior transform once they realized who he was. He looked around the beautiful restaurant with its crystal chandeliers and fine artwork. Places like this were built on perceptions of wealth, of status, of belonging. Those perceptions too often left no room for someone who looked like him, unless they carried visible markers of success that overrode assumptions based on skin color. Thomas finished his meal thoughtfully, preparing for the conversation to come. It wasn't the confrontation he had planned for his evening, but perhaps it could become something meaningful. For Richard, for the restaurant, and for the next person who walked through those doors and deserved to be treated with dignity, regardless of who they might be. As Thomas finished the last bite of his duck, he noticed Richard hovering nearby, clearly nervous about their upcoming conversation. The waiter approached with practiced professionalism, though his earlier confidence had visibly diminished. "Was everything to your satisfaction, sir?" Richard asked, reaching for the empty plate. "The food was excellent," Thomas replied honestly. He dabbed his mouth with the napkin and placed it beside his plate. "About that conversation, of course," Richard said quickly, "though I should mention that we're quite busy this evening." His eyes darted around the restaurant as if seeking an escape route. "I won't take much of your time," Thomas assured him. "Perhaps there's somewhere a bit more private we could speak." Richard hesitated, then nodded. "There's a small alcove near the wine cellar. If you'll follow me." Thomas stood and followed Richard through the main dining area. He noticed how other diners watched them with curious eyes, perhaps wondering about the quiet man in casual clothes who had somehow earned such deference from the staff. They passed Diane's table, where she gave Thomas a questioning look. He nodded slightly to indicate everything was fine. After Diane returned to her table, Thomas enjoyed his souffle in peaceful solitude. It was indeed exceptional, rich and complex with a warm chocolate center that flowed onto the plate when he broke through the delicate outer shell. As he ate, he observed the restaurant with new eyes. At a nearby table, a young couple was celebrating what appeared to be an anniversary. The woman kept touching a new bracelet on her wrist, clearly a gift given earlier that evening. Their waiter, not Richard but a younger man with an eager-to-please expression, was explaining the wine list to them with patience and enthusiasm. Across the room, a group of business people were finishing their meal, their conversation punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter. They were dressed in expensive suits, their watches and jewelry subtle signals of wealth and status. The staff attended to them with practiced efficiency. Thomas wondered how many other people had walked through those doors and been judged, categorized and treated according to quick assumptions about their worth, how many had left feeling diminished, unwelcome, or angry, and how many had simply accepted it as the way things were. When he finished his dessert, Richard returned with the check. "I hope you enjoyed the soufflé," he said. "It lived up to your recommendation," Thomas confirmed. Richard hesitated, then said quietly, "I wanted to thank you again for our conversation. It's given me a lot to think about." Thomas nodded. "I'm glad to hear that." After Richard walked away, Thomas looked at the check. The soufflé had been removed from the bill, a gesture that would have seemed like special treatment earlier but now felt like a small acknowledgement of their shared understanding. He left a generous tip, signed the receipt, and prepared to leave. As he stood, he noticed the restaurant manager hovering nearby, clearly wanting to speak with him but unsure of the proper approach. Thomas made it easier by walking over to him. "Mr. Wilson," the manager said, having clearly learned his name in the interim. "I hope everything was satisfactory this evening." "The food was excellent," Thomas said. "And Richard provided educational service?" The manager looked confused by the choice of words. "Educational?" "We had a valuable conversation," Thomas explained, "about perceptions and assumptions." "I see," the manager said, though it was clear he didn't fully understand. "If there was any issue with your service initially, it's been addressed," Thomas assured him. "Though you might consider whether it's an isolated incident or a pattern within your establishment." The manager's expression tightened slightly. "Lucille prides itself on treating all our guests with respect." "That's a worthy goal," Thomas said. "The question is whether it's being achieved consistently." He left the manager with that thought and made his way toward the exit. As he passed Diane's table, she called out to him, "Thomas, I meant to ask, we're doing a follow-up piece on corporate leadership and community development. Would you be willing to be interviewed again?" "Of course," he agreed. "Have your office contact mine to set it up." "Perfect," Diane said. "And by the way, that waiter who was giving you trouble earlier? He just came over and apologized to me for interrupting our conversation. Said he was learning to do better. Whatever you said to him seems to have made an impression." Thomas smiled. "Small steps. Sometimes those are the ones that take us furthest," Diane replied. Outside, the night air felt fresh and cool after the warmth of the restaurant. Thomas waited as the valet brought his car around. Another couple exited behind him, an older man and woman, both dressed impeccably. The woman was adjusting an expensive-looking shawl around her shoulders. "Wasn't that Thomas Wilson from Global Tech?" the woman asked her companion, not bothering to lower her voice. "I believe it was," the man confirmed. "Surprising to see him here. He's usually more private. Did you see how casually he was dressed? I suppose when you're worth billions you can dress however you like," the woman remarked with a laugh. Thomas smiled to himself as he got into his car. Some lessons would take longer to sink in than others. 2 weeks later, Thomas was in his office reviewing quarterly reports when his assistant buzzed him. "There's a Richard Patterson here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says you might remember him from Lucille Restaurant." Thomas was surprised but intrigued. "Send him in." Richard entered the office with none of the confidence he displayed at the restaurant. Here in Thomas's domain, he seemed smaller somehow, less certain. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm and wore a neat but modest suit rather than his waiter's uniform. "Mr. Wilson," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment." Thomas shook his hand. "What brings you here, Richard?" "Our conversation that night." "It stayed with me," Richard explained. "It made me think about a lot of things, not just how I treat guests at the restaurant, but larger patterns in the industry." He opened his portfolio and removed a neatly typed document. "I've developed a proposal for a training program about unconscious bias in hospitality settings. I've already presented it to my manager at Lucille, and he's interested in implementing it, but I wanted to get your input." Given your experience both as someone who's faced bias and as a CEO who oversees large-scale training programs. Thomas was genuinely surprised. May I? He asked, reaching for the document. Of course, Richard said, handing it over. Thomas scanned the proposal. It was thoughtfully put together, with specific examples of how bias manifests in restaurant settings, practical exercises for staff to recognize their own biases, and measurable outcomes for improvement. It wasn't perfect, but it showed real effort and understanding. This is impressive, Thomas said honestly, especially considering it's only been 2 weeks since our conversation. Richard nodded. I haven't been able to stop thinking about it, about all the guests I might have treated differently over the years based on snap judgments. It's uncomfortable to face, but necessary. Growth usually is uncomfortable, Thomas agreed. What do you hope to achieve with this program? Initially, just awareness among the staff at Ciel, Richard explained. But eventually, I'd like to see something like this implemented across the restaurant group we belong to. Maybe even industry-wide someday. Thomas set the proposal down and studied Richard thoughtfully. That's ambitious. Too ambitious? Richard asked, uncertainty crossing his face. Not at all, Thomas assured him. The best changes often start with ambitious ideas. He tapped the proposal. This has potential. I'd be happy to give you more detailed feedback, and perhaps connect you with our head of diversity and inclusion training here at Global Tech. She might have some insights that would be valuable. Relief and excitement washed over Richard's face. That would be incredible. Thank you. One question, Thomas said. Why take this on? You could have just adjusted your own behavior and moved on. Why develop an entire program? Richard considered the question carefully. When you spoke about that young girl at the computer center, the one who might grow up to be a CEO someday, it made me think about my own daughter. She's 11. I want her to grow up in a world where people see her potential, not just their preconceptions about her. And I realized that change has to start somewhere. Why not with me? Thomas nodded, a sense of satisfaction warming him. Their conversation in the restaurant's alcove had planted a seed, and now it was beginning to grow in unexpected ways. Let me make a few calls, he said, reaching for his phone. I think there are some people you should meet. 6 months later, Thomas stood at the podium in the grand ballroom of the Westbrook Hotel, looking out at an audience of restaurant managers, hospitality executives, and industry professionals. The room buzzed with anticipation as attendees flipped through the glossy program for the annual Hospitality Leadership Conference. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Thomas said into the microphone. When I first met Richard Patterson, he was serving me dinner at Ciel. Today, he's here to talk about the Dignity in Dining initiative that's been implemented in over 30 restaurants across our city. Please welcome Richard Patterson. Applause filled the room as Richard approached the stage. Gone was the nervous waiter from 6 months ago. In his place stood a man with purpose in his stride and conviction in his eyes. He shook Thomas's hand warmly before taking his place at the podium. Thank you, Thomas, Richard began, adjusting the microphone. And thank you all for being here today. My journey to this stage began with a mistake, a serious one that many of us in the hospitality industry make every day without even realizing it. Richard paused, looking out at the attentive faces. I judged a guest based on his appearance. I made assumptions about his ability to afford certain menu items, his knowledge of fine wines, even his right to sit at certain tables in our restaurant. And I treated him accordingly. Murmurs rippled through the audience as Richard continued. What I didn't know was that this guest was Thomas Wilson, CEO of Global Tech and one of the most successful business leaders in our city. But here's the thing, and this is crucial, it shouldn't have mattered who he was. Every person who walks through our doors deserves the same level of respect and dignity, regardless of their appearance, their race, or their perceived status. Thomas watched from his seat at the side of the stage, a sense of pride warming his chest. In the months since their conversation at Ciel, he had watched Richard transform from a waiter with unconscious biases to a passionate advocate for change in his industry. The training program that began as a simple proposal had evolved into something much bigger. The Dignity in Dining initiative isn't just about sensitivity training, Richard explained to the audience. It's about recognizing the subtle ways bias influences our interactions, understanding the impact those biases have on our guests, and developing practical strategies to ensure everyone receives the same high-quality service. On the screen behind him, photographs appeared. Diverse guests being welcomed into restaurants, staff engaged in training sessions, before and after metrics showing improvements in customer satisfaction scores across demographic groups. When we first implemented this program at Le Ciel, Richard continued, some staff members were resistant. They insisted they treated everyone equally. But the data told a different story. When we began tracking wait times, table assignments, and service interactions, patterns emerged that couldn't be ignored. He clicked to the next slide, showing a graph with clear disparities in service metrics. Once we could see the problem in black and white, it became impossible to deny. And that's when real change began to happen. As Richard continued his presentation, Thomas thought back to the series of events that had brought them here. After their initial meeting in his office, Thomas had connected Richard with Vanessa Liu, Global Tech's head of diversity and inclusion training. Together they had refined Richard's proposal, adding data collection methods, accountability measures, and practical training exercises. Thomas had also introduced Richard to several restaurant owners in his network, people who understood that addressing bias wasn't just the right thing to do, it was good business. Word began to spread, and what started as a single restaurant's initiative had grown into a movement within the local hospitality industry. The results speak for themselves, Richard was saying, pointing to another slide. Restaurants that have implemented the full program have seen a 12% increase in overall customer satisfaction, a 20% increase in positive reviews from minority guests, and a 15% increase in repeat business. He smiled at the audience. Turns out treating everyone with dignity and respect is not just ethically right, it's profitable too. Laughter rippled through the crowd, followed by appreciative applause. But numbers only tell part of the story. Richard continued, his voice softening. The real impact is in the individual experiences, the guest who finally feels welcome, the staff member who recognizes their own biases and grows beyond them, the restaurant that becomes a truly inclusive space for everyone. As Richard's presentation concluded, the applause was enthusiastic. Industry leaders lined up at the microphones placed in the aisles, eager to ask questions about implementing the program in their own establishments. Thomas watched with satisfaction as Richard answered each question thoughtfully, his expertise evident. Later that evening, Thomas and Richard sat in the hotel bar, celebrating the successful presentation with a quiet drink. I still can't believe how far this has come, Richard said, shaking his head in wonder. From a conversation in an alcove to a keynote at the biggest hospitality conference in the region. It's impressive, Thomas agreed. But it wouldn't have happened without your willingness to change and your determination to bring others along with you. Richard nodded thoughtfully. You know, my daughter came to see the presentation today. She sat in the back row. Afterward, she told me it was the first time she'd ever felt proud of what I do for a living. That's quite a compliment, Thomas said. It is, Richard agreed. She's at that age where she's starting to notice how the world treats people differently. We've had some hard conversations about it, but now she sees her dad trying to make a difference even in a small way. Thomas smiled. Sometimes small changes lead to bigger ones. Speaking of changes, Richard said, reaching into his jacket pocket, I wanted to share something with you. He pulled out a folded letter and handed it to Thomas. Thomas opened it, quickly scanning the contents. It was a job offer from the Westbrook Hotel Group, a position as Director of Training and Development, with a focus on implementing the Dignity in Dining program across their entire chain of hotels and restaurants. They approached me after the presentation, Richard explained. It would mean leaving restaurant service, but the opportunity to expand the program nationwide. His voice trailed off, the magnitude of the opportunity evident in his expression. This is outstanding, Thomas said, genuinely pleased. Are you going to take it? I think so, Richard replied. It's a big change, but I feel like this is what I'm meant to be doing now. Thomas handed the letter back with a nod of approval. From waiter to director in 6 months. That's quite a journey. A journey that started with you calling me out on my behavior, Richard pointed out. Most people in your position wouldn't have bothered. Thomas shrugged. Most people in my position have been dealing with this kind of thing their whole lives. You either get angry, get worn down, or try to create change. I found the last option is the only one that helps me sleep at night. They fell into comfortable silence, each reflecting on the unexpected path that had brought them together. Around them, the bar hummed with conversation, hotel guests and conference attendees unwinding after a long day. "I heard you're speaking at the National Business Leadership Forum next month," Richard said eventually. "About corporate responsibility and community development?" Thomas nodded. "Diane's article led to some interesting opportunities. Will you tell our story?" Richard asked. "About Luciel and what happened after?" "If you're comfortable with it," Thomas replied. "I think it's a powerful example of how change can happen when people are willing to have difficult conversations." "I am comfortable with it," Richard confirmed. "Even the unflattering parts. Especially those, actually. People need to understand that growth often starts with discomfort." As they finished their drinks and prepared to leave, a young waiter approached their table. He was nervous, clearly new to the job. "Excuse me," he said, looking between them. "I just wanted to say that I attended your presentation today, Mr. Patterson. I'm working here part-time while I'm in hospitality management school. What you said about bias in service? It really made me think. I'm going to pay more attention to how I treat different guests." Richard smiled at the young man. "What's your name?" "Luis," the waiter replied. "Well, Luis, being aware is the first step," Richard said warmly. "The fact that you're thinking about it puts you ahead of where I was at your age." After Luis left, Richard turned to Thomas with a grin. "And so it continues." "Indeed it does," Thomas agreed. As they walked through the hotel lobby, Thomas reflected on how a single evening at a restaurant had sparked a chain of events that neither of them could have predicted. What began as an uncomfortable encounter had transformed into something meaningful. A program that was changing industry practices, a new career path for Richard, and perhaps most importantly, countless improved experiences for restaurant guests who would never know the story behind the changes they were benefiting from. It was a reminder that change rarely happened in grand, dramatic moments. More often it grew from small seeds, a conversation, a moment of honesty, a willingness to listen and learn. And sometimes those small seeds grew into something that could transform not just individual lives, but entire systems. Thomas and Richard parted ways at the hotel entrance, each heading back to lives that looked very different than they had 6 months ago. But they were connected now by the change they had created together, change that would continue to ripple outward in ways they might never fully know.